what these are is, when we think of peace, and you ask somebody, what does peace mean? They always give you an answer initially in the dual world. Absence of war, absence of conflict. They tell you what peace is in its contrast. But when you're working with these words like shanti and shalom, salam, you are working with words in which the element of peace is its own ground, it's its own river. So in other words, shalom is not peace, meaning absence of conflict or war. It's the divine energy and the divine quality of peace that permeates everything deep underneath. And I think this was so important that when the Israelis and the Egyptians formed that treaty many, many decades ago, when they were putting together the plan, they were using different words to describe the absence of conflict, and they would no longer have conflict. The Israelis were absolutely adamant that the words shalom and salam would be used because they meant core, root, divine qualities. In other words, it's the state of peace itself, the divine quality of peace. It's not peace as absence of conflict, violence, etc., but it's a pure state of its own.
Beautifully said. Wow. Well, I do have a question about your Black Swan Counseling. How did you choose that name?
Okay, it has two stories.
Okay.
One is at the time.
Figured there had to be a story there.
At the time, we were in the Swananoa Valley Medical Center in Black Mountain, and we were looking for a name, and I kind of went, Black Swan. You know, it communicated both of those, and at the same time, the minute I said it, I realized I had come up with an archetypal image. And of course, for me, it's all of that transformative stuff of Swan Lake. You know, like I start hearing the music in my head, and so it's an archetypal image of transformation, finding something, you know, that initially looks ugly, and long before the movie came out, that, you know, that made it look very different. Although that's an interesting discussion too. But that transformation from something that seems ordinary or even ugly to something beautiful and wonderful. And then John discovered, here's another story.
Yes, that you know, the black swan is not an anomaly within, you know, many, many generations of white swans. You don't suddenly, out of a whole group of white swans, get occasionally the black swan. Black swan is an entire species of swan, and they actually they were originally in along the southern coast of Australia. And what happened in Europe in the 1500s and 1600s, they used the scientific community used the expression when something was really obvious was that it was just a white swan, because all anybody had ever seen was a white swan. They knew you occasionally get a black sheep or something, but you never ever get anything other than a white swan. So if in the scientific community they were coming out with a new theory that they were postulating and were trying to explain it, but if the theory was so obvious that it didn't require a lot of discussion, like, you know, we jokingly say, is the Pope Catholic? Well, they would say, well, that's just another white swan, that it can only be that. And then European travelers, I think the early 1700s, discovered the black swans on the south coast of Australia, came back to Europe and told them about all these black swans, and suddenly the scientific community in Europe could no longer use that expression, well, that's just another white swan. But one of the things that we also like to look at in this quality of that black swans were always there for millennium in the south of Australia. Other parts of the world just didn't know that they were there because they hadn't traveled, but they were there all the time. So we think of the black swan as also a metaphor for that wonderful hidden treasure and beauty in ourselves that was there all the time, that we are just coming to start to notice. But that treasure and that beauty has always been there, and now we're just bringing it forth and discovering it.
That's beautiful. Well, this could go on for hours upon end, and I do hope that you all come back. And I want to lead us to, first of all, give anyone an opportunity that might have a question for either Claudia or John or both. Yeah.
Well, you're speaking of Elohim. another Hebrew word for God is Yahweh.
Yes.
How does that fit in anywhere?
Yes, and that's the one in which the vowels are missing in between. And it is another, it's one of the names for the divine. I mean, there's many of them. There's Shaddai, Ad-Shaddai, there's Adonai, all these many different ones. And that's, Yahweh is one of the more current ones. But what I'll just say very, very quickly about a word like Yahweh, and also like in Hebrew, in Kabbalah, or it's actually pronounced Kabbalah, they oftentimes will spell God G, and then it's a blank space and a D, and they don't put the vowel in there, meaning that there's aspects of the divine that are so totally beyond our comprehension, so indescribable, you can't even fit all, you might say put the letters in. But also, if I recall, in the earliest form of Hebrew, they didn't actually put the vowels in.
Just YHWH.
Yes. And then it eventually evolved to something where there might be little dots or markings above or below the consonants that would give you a sense of what the vowel was, and then eventually the vowels were put in. Well, my feeling is that consonants in words and sacred words give you the sense of structure and form, and the vowels give you the sense of emotional and spiritual impact. And my own feeling, this is just, I'm just answering you from my own, what I feel intuitively. I believe that in the earliest days, the reason why the vowels weren't put in and only consonants were used, that it restricted to a very special class of priests or, metaphysical teachers, with the idea that knowing what those vowels were would take a word of consonants and you might say totally bring it to life and bring out its true deep mystical qualities. So almost like what the vowels were a little bit of a mystical secret, because if you knew what the vowels were going to be, then that gave the entire word a whole shape and a form depending on what the vowels were. So that's
Thank you.
in response to that, at least my own personal one.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else? We can do one more question here if someone. Okay. Well, I would like to, anything else you would like to share before we?
I always settle in, It's just that idea that, for each of us, what we're growing into is that quality of self-love, self-appreciation, seeing the divine in ourselves, and not meaning that that has to be a perfection in the sense that we would define perfection, not to get caught in the idea that somehow that means everything is all squeaky clean and perfect. In fact, seeing the divine in ourselves sometimes leads us a merry chase into areas that we really had not anticipated. But the other quality is that we're doing this in community, and that as we are open and we gather and we sort of send that openness to people that we see in the world who are either not well guided in some way, or who aren't acknowledging the guidance, or who are caught in turmoil and strife, if we can keep the heart open to that and keep growing, I think that is what is going to usher us into what humanity is capable of being.
I'm not sure that I want to follow that.
The Tibetan bowl.
That would be great.
That would be wonderful, yes. I know, how could we?
Honestly, I have a few things that I was thinking about saying as she was speaking, but then when Claudia finished, I thought, sometimes enough is enough. Sometimes you don't, as the proverb goes, you don't try to add legs to the snake. And this is a wonderful, it's an antique Tibetan singing bowl. It's over 200 years old.
Awesome.
The antiques have the most incredible sound. The sustain and the resonance just goes on forever. Nothing at all like the contemporary ones. And this particular one was the very first one I found, and I actually heard it in a dream many, many years before, where I knew that these existed, but I hadn't actually seen one firsthand and really wasn't paying much attention to them. And then I had a lucid dream in which I saw a bowl, and the bowl was making a tone. And while I was dreaming, part of me was saying to myself, remember that pitch, remember that tone. And when I woke up the next day, I was living in upstate New York, near Saratoga Springs, and I had the day off, and I thought, well, down in Woodstock, there's a shop called Dharmaware that I remember saying that they sell Tibetan bowls. So I drove right straight down there. The fellow that ran the store, showed me how to make a sound off them. And then I just went around trying them all out. When I hit the bowl that I heard in my dream, instantly I knew that's the one. No doubt this is the one in my dream. When I brought it up to pay for it, the owner said, oh, you picked out one of only 2 antiques in the entire store.
Whoa.
And this was this very one. So it's a just beautiful, beautiful sound. And then it goes up in octaves as you work with it.
So it is.
That is beautiful. Wow. Well, you all are amazing. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, John.
Thanks for
And
having me.
this was beautiful.
Yeah.
And it was a real treat to have both of you all here today. Thank you.